Prospect House Media.
And now, prepare yourself for the only weekly podcast you won't want to miss. Welcome to the Ameritocracy Show with Troy Edgar, live from our studios in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C.
Hey everybody, I am Troy Edgar and welcome to the Ameritocracy Show. Thank you for tuning in and checking it out. It is greatly appreciated. This podcast examines the conditions for personal and economic growth and opportunity across America. Aloha! This week, I took Ameritocracy on the road to Hawaii and met with Honolulu Mayor Rick Blangiardi, who was kind enough to host me at the historic Honolulu City Hall in the mayor's office. The mayor and I talked about starting out in Cambridge, Massachusetts, his early connections to Hawaii, and his transition from a successful television and broadcasting career to public service. As a previous mayor myself and technology executive at IBM Consulting in the federal sector, I really enjoyed our discussion on the modernization of city government and running government like a business. The mayor has built a great team in a short amount of time and talks about some of the challenges that lies ahead. I also want to provide a special thanks to Scott Humber and Lisa Chun for assisting me with this episode. This episode was recorded 1 week before the unfortunate Maui wildfire tragedy. I send my prayers and condolences to the people of Maui. I also encourage anyone interested in supporting those affected by this disaster to donate to the American Red Cross at redcross.org. Mahalo, and I hope you enjoy. Good afternoon, Mayor. How are you doing?
Good. Very well, Troy. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to really thank you very much for taking the time to meet with me today.
No, I'm looking forward to this conversation. We don't know each other, so I always like that in this kind of a dynamic because I'm curious as to what questions you might be asking me.
I promise, Mayor, I'll take care of you. It'll all be good. But
if
Mayor,
you're not, I'll let you know. How's that?
I know you will. I know you will. I did a lot of research to prepare to make sure that the listeners get the most out of this discussion. And first of all, what I would like to do, if you wouldn't mind, just to expand on a little bit of an introduction of yourself to folks here in Hawaii. You're a staple, a household name, but the mainland, people be very fascinated with your background. Would you mind just giving a little bit of your details?
Sure. And I'm not so sure I'm a household name, but maybe. I don't know. I think this role of being mayor, you want to have that. Actually, that's you want people to be aware of who you are, what you're doing, and why you're doing it on their behalf. So a little bit of my background. I was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts on September 15th, 1946. That means I'm about a month away or so from turning 77 years of age. Grew up there, grammar school, high school. Played a lot of sports in high school, had some options out of there, was recruited by the Naval Academy. I was the first in my family to go to college. Really didn't know what we were doing at the time. Wanted to make my father proud. He was a veteran of World War II. It was that era, that generation. And I agreed to go to the Naval Academy. However, I was somewhat academically flawed in that I had to get my math SAT scores up. And that was really the feeder system for the service academy. In fact, Navy had 3 of these prep schools. But to go to Navy at the time was a big deal because between 1960 and 64, not only because of the halo effect of World War II, if you will, and the impact that had on our fathers, because all of the kids I went to school with, we were that generation. Everybody went through World War II, their parents. But also Navy had produced 2 Heisman Trophy winners in Roger Staubach and Joe Bellino, and it was a really, from a football standpoint, considered a very prestigious opportunity, both as a military academy and the fact that its football prowess was good. So I made that decision. And I realized that I didn't have the academics for naval engineering at the time. There was only one curriculum. We took all the same courses as the plebes. I was all set to go to Boston College when in 1965, the spring of 1965, my father was a machinist working at a place that got closed down, Watertown Arsenal, by Robert McNamara, but they offered him a transfer to one of 2 places, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, or Newport News, Virginia. My mother picked Pearl Harbor at the age of 18. I didn't want to disappoint my mother, even though I was all set to go to BC, and that changed my destiny, and that's how I came to Hawaii.
Wow. Yeah. Now that you're at Hawaii at that point, early time, very similar for me. I came here when I was 18, 19 in the Navy. I was on the sub base here. But it left a lasting impression with me. I was talking to you before we got on mic that every year my wife and I come at least once or twice. We celebrate my birthday and our anniversary here. And when the kids were young, and my kids are all like 26, 28, and 35, they definitely, this was our vacation spot. But it was just because it's special. And I find myself coming to Waikiki and Oahu more than the outer islands I did with my kids, because it's just, once it grabs hold of you, it doesn't let you go. And I think what's interesting about your story is you began to establish your bona fides here in Hawaii, because it's also a place that's very local.
Yeah.
And so could you talk a little bit about, so you're here at 18 and kind of, you left the island, you started doing some coaching, and then you kind of came back to the island and built up your career here.
Yeah. Well, I had the benefit of playing football here. I played college football as an undergraduate and did pretty well doing that. And then I had to go back east to take care of my mother, but I started coaching at the University of Connecticut. My parents moved back east, but my mother got very sick, and actually their marriage fell apart. And so as the oldest son, not unlike my decision to come out here in support of her dream, my mother was the youngest of 9. Both my parents came from immigrant families. My mother was the youngest of 9. My father was the oldest of 7. And family, and they're both Italian. And in that generation especially, that filial responsibility to one's parents was really something that we all grew up with. It was very strong. So I went back there. So I started coaching at the University of Connecticut, but the guy I played for here in Hawaii named Larry Price, he understood the circumstances of why I left. I wasn't just some kid who showed up and then left, And I had a lot of success playing. So he invited me back to coach with him, coach linebackers. He was the defensive coordinator at the time. And then I did, and I came back to graduate school, got my master's here at the University of Hawaii, and coached, and then got promoted to full-time. And then a couple years into it, he became the head coach of the University of Hawaii football program, and he then made me the number 1 assistant. I took his place as the defensive coordinator, and then he promoted me to associate head football coach. And I thought I was doing everything right. We were winning in those days. We had really good football teams, playing a lot of interesting people. Big schools, small schools, but we were an independent. It was before Hawaii got into the Western Athletic Conference. But everybody in those years, unlike the pressures of winning today, having Hawaii on their schedule was a cool recruiting tool for them. Football was very different back in the 70s. So, they wanted to schedule us, and we were willing to play anybody. You bring them on. So it was a great experience. I was doing everything right, and I had a lot of success, except I wasn't making any money. That was the reason why I went to college. So in those years, we all coached for the love of the game, and so the head coach was making $25,000 a year, and I was making $15,300, and my assistant coaches were all getting $1,000 a month, and one of whom, Dom Capers, went on to be a head coach in the NFL, not of one but 2 teams, the Carolina Panthers and the Houston Texans, but nonetheless, we were young coaches together. My wife got pregnant with my now oldest son, older than your children. My oldest son's 45, and I was at a crossroads whether to go back to the mainland and take a coaching job. But not unlike what you just said a few moments ago, the seduction of this place is powerful.
Yeah.
And there used to be a saying the Hawaii Visitors Bureau used. It would simply say, come for the beauty, but stay for the people. And I had really fallen in love with its people, and I decided, I was 30 years old at the time, that I knew I could coach. I had enough confidence in that. But in the spirit of family and having my first child and son, I thought I would stay here, try to reinvent myself. And I knew if I ever transitioned from coaching into business, that I didn't have a business degree. And my kid brother had an MBA, and he was a CPA on top of that. And I knew I wasn't cut from that kind of cloth. So I literally backed into a television sales job. Because I knew the guy who was doing sports then, because I used to do the interviews. I knew nothing about it, but the owner of the station at the time said to me, and remember, I'm making $15,000 a year. I make a decision for economic reasons. I got a baby coming, And he says, look, Rick, if you're willing to work hard in this business, in 3 years, you could make $50,000 a year.
Wow.
And look, I went to college to have a better life. That was the aspiration, dream of my parents, and even for me. But never talked about making money. But that was always in the background, right? But in coaching, that wasn't the criteria. So now I had a chance to go and do something for the very reasons I went to school. And if all I had to do was work hard, even though I knew nothing about the business, I could learn, and I would try to make $50,000 a year in 3 years, like he said, because that just so happened to be double what the head coach was making and triple what I was making.
Wow.
Seemed like a big number at the time. Mm-hmm. So I made that decision based on that, and retired from coaching on March 4th, 1977, and that was a Friday. And on Monday morning, on March 7th, I walked in and began a television sales job at the lowest level one can begin at a television station. And 43 years later, I retired from that business to run for this job.
Yeah. No, I think what's interesting about your background too is like you were here and you did that. TV stations, I've done work in the entertainment field also, and they get sold, and you may be on the wrong side of the sale. Yeah. And I noticed you had went to Seattle. So you left the island a few times and came back here.
Well, yeah. Here's what happened. I Mustanged my way through that television station. I started at a low level. Within 5 years, I was a general sales manager, which in the sales hierarchy was the number one guy, right? And then 2 years after that, I got offered my first general manager's job, and took that. And then 2 years into it, we sold to a very prestigious broadcast company, the King Broadcasting Company, and that's how I became part of that family. And then in 1989, on my 43rd birthday, I was in Laramie, Wyoming, and I got a phone call thinking that my boss at the time was just calling me up to say happy birthday. I was up there to do a football game, University of Hawaii versus Wyoming. After coaching, I spent 13 years on air, radio, and TV. So I went up there and I called him, and instead of him saying happy birthday, which he did, he told me they made a decision in Seattle. I was hoping that I would be willing to move my family and come up and run the flagship station.
Wow.
I'm 43 years old. I'd been in one market. Mm-hmm. This is one of the most coveted, highly prestigious jobs in America. They could have hired anybody, and I didn't even know the job was open, but they made room for me. And it was just one of those things that somebody once said to me, that the purpose of all education is to do those things that you have to do at the time you have to do them, whether or not you want to do them. Mm-hmm. That was one of those moments. Mm-hmm. There was no way I could say no to that job. I mean, I come back home from Wyoming, talked to my then young wife, and we had 3 children at the time, about moving our family to Seattle after having been in Hawaii for a lot of years, from 71 all the way to 89, and really had gotten established in the community. And, again, staying associated with football in this town was big, and being an announcer on air, but had created some success as well as a business guy and in the nonprofit work and just the various leadership things I did. So I made that decision at 43. And actually, that triggered a 13-year odyssey. And so I spent several years in Seattle. And as you just alluded to, that company, which little did I know they brought me in to kind of turn things around, they sold, which I never thought they would. I'm not so sure if I knew that, I ever would have left Hawaii, because that then sort of put me in play. From Seattle, I went to New York, worked at CBS in New York, had a very high-level job, and I was being brought in to run the Boston station. They were going to buy Boston, only that deal never happened. That spent 2 years in New York City, a little bit more than that. And I was hired by Peter Lund, then the president of CBS. So and so from there I went to San Francisco, KPIX for Westinghouse, ran radio and TV and radio. It was a big market, big station, big operation. And I let some guys buy me out of that, and I became president of my first broadcast group. Did that for a couple of years. We sold that company. Was sort of in transition. Headhunter called. I decided to go to LA to take over and try to launch this cable network that was dedicated to horse lifestyle. It was a great concept, but the delay of the digital rollout really impaired our ability to get distribution. It was like one of those things in the old analog world that you either had to have distribution to get financing, and if you had in order to get the distribution, you had to have the programming, and it was a chicken and egg. We just couldn't quite do it. We raised about $60 million, but we couldn't quite get there. And make a long story short, that job led to my becoming president of a company called Telemundo. And I'd gone into that job being recruited by the then president of Columbia TriStar, a guy named Barry Thurston, who was representing Sony in the equation. They were one of the owners, along with Liberty Media and 2 private equity guys. And they just lost $100 million in their first year of operation, fired everybody, called me up, asked me to meet him at the commissary. I didn't apply for the job. I go over there, and he's actually having lunch with the famous Jim Cameron. I remember sitting down with Jim, Titanic Jim Cameron. What am I doing here? And he tells me, he says, look, we hired a search firm, Heidrick and Struggles, and I've got 43 resumes, veritable who's who wants to be president of this company that we just lost $100 million on, but your name isn't in here. Why not? I said, well, I don't speak Spanish. He goes, none of these guys do either. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for somebody who understands the business. And I said to him, I said, why me? And I haven't really shared this very much. I'll just tell you,
Sure.
Even though we just met. He said something to me that was very powerful, and it actually, because I grew up in a bilingual household, but he said to me that, because he knew me when I was in Hawaii, he said, you're one of the most culturally fluent guys I've ever met. And that meant a lot. Mm-hmm. And that was tied to my own lineage, my own upbringing. And at the time I grew up in Boston, I grew up in an Italian neighborhood, but Boston was very ethnocentric, and all of us were sons and daughters of people that came from other countries. But really it was my experience in Hawaii and that cultural fluency and the transition here. And so even though none of that cultural fluency was Spanish-oriented, per se, it really kind of did relate to my background in the sense that I think I understood the immigrant experience of why people come to a country, because I knew I grew up with that and was really deeply imbued. So I took it, and we did really, really well, and we turned that company around, and I was in charge of the station group and started off with 9 stations, 3 were negative EBITDA. We finished up with 11. I was buying a 12th. All of them, which more than tripled the EBITDA of the company, was very attractive. We were supposed to go public. If we did, I'm not so sure I'd be sitting here today. Instead, we sold to NBC. And that in and of itself is a great success story, because we were in a bidding war, and I was leading the due diligence as president of the company because they were interested in the distribution. And the one thing about Telemundo, and we were in all the top 10 U.S. markets, and that's what they wanted, was a conduit to this rapidly growing consumer market through these television stations. And that's why we were, we got into this bidding thing between Viacom and GE, as it turned out, CBS and NBC, and then 9/11 happened. And I was in Nashville, Tennessee at the Grand Ole Opry Hotel on 9/11. Thought the deal would be off because everything was so New York-centric. And by the end of that week, we had an offer on the table from NBC if it would take CBS out of the bidding, that they would pay no less than $2 billion for our company. Discussed it with the CEO of the company. I was only the president. Jim McNamara was the CEO. And he was going to take it to the board, and sure enough, the board said, let's do it, because the whole world was uncertain. The week after 9/11, I mean, none of us knew. I mean, it took me 3 days to get out of Nashville. Yep. And even then, when I landed in LA, we landed at a gate I never got off at before. Armed guards met us and walked us to the baggage claim. It was surreal,
Yep.
9/11 happened. We announced that deal 1 month to the day on October 11th, Jim McNamara and Bob Wright on CNBC, that we sold the company for $2.7 billion. What I'm proud of in the wake of that is it was not only 1 month to the day after 9/11, but it was the largest deal in NBC's history by a factor of 4.
Wow.
It was Jeff Immelt's first deal after succeeding Jack Welch on the heels of the Honeywell deal, the merger with GE and Honeywell in Europe, being disbanded because of antitrust violations. So it was a lot of scrutiny, but still yet we got that deal done. And that was actually my marching orders from September 15th, is to get it there. And I can tell you, in that month, I couldn't tell you what day of the week it was. I mean, I was on airplanes. Honest to God, I could give you all kinds of examples. I wake up in Miami, work in Chicago, sleep in Houston.
Yep.
I'm not kidding. And that went on for a very intense month. Got to the point of we satisfied, and then it was to get it closed. And then we got the deal closed in 6 months and a day, which was more the same of what I just described. Because the one thing, the old Wall Street line, money never sleeps. You got a bunch of private equity guys who had a $500 million investment, lost $100 million in the first year, and now suddenly we're going to cash out just 3 years later,
Wow.
to those kind of numbers, they're on you.
Yeah.
They're on you to make the deal happen.
Yeah, no rest.
No mercy.
Yeah.
Okay. But that was exciting, and it was also an experience for me where I knew I wouldn't do that again. And it just so happened coincidental that I had 25 years in the business. I was proud of the time that I spent on the mainland, the 13 years, the things that I had done. I'd been president of 2 companies and ran major market stations in Seattle and San Francisco and tried to launch a cable network. I was a good body of work during those years, and had a choice. Had a choice in my life on whether I wanted to stay with NBC, which they certainly gave me an offer, or stay. I really didn't want to stay with Telemundo. I wanted to leave it under some different terms. And that the reason why I didn't want is I didn't speak the language. And what I found repeatedly, having grown up in a bilingual household, I was extremely sensitive to the fact that as president of Telemundo, I would go to the various cities, go to these big events. Everybody spoke Spanish, and I wasn't able to do that. And I never had the chance or the opportunity to learn the language. Everybody said, yeah, you just get let's put a headset. I would get on airplanes and fall asleep on the tarmac because we were pushing so hard all the time. I never had a chance to go to Mexico for an immersion course or any of that. So I always felt like I was, I didn't feel like I was being respected because the language, and that was the whole thing between Spanish language television, is that cultural tie for the people who immigrated to our country in America was the language. And I understood that having, grown up, like I said, in an Italian-speaking household. So not being able to do that, but being able to do all the other stuff, never sat well with me. So I always knew, and I told NBC that you need to hire a Latino in this role. You do, because and so, make a long story short, I didn't want to stay with NBC and had this opportunity to come back to Hawaii. And I can say this, when I came back, when I finally made the decision to come back and work for a guy named Jeff Smyton in MS Communications and run both the Fox affiliate and the CBS affiliate, and they're upside down. I remember saying to the press rather glibly, I said, I moved to the mainland in '89, but I never left Hawaii.
There you go.
And which was true, because I used to come back almost every year, and sometimes more than once a year, and especially in significant moments, like when my mother died, and after we finished, so I came here for a few days of just getting in touch.
But, something that I think is interesting, and the reason why, first of all, I really appreciate you giving that level of detail, because for this podcast, we are focused on really trying to kind of look at the process of merit and accomplish and credentialing. And, the 2 things that you get from that story is, one, your cultural awareness to even look at the top job at Telemundo and say, as well as I could try to fit in there, which, by the way, there's probably kind of a parallel between that and coming into Hawaii and whether you would ever fully be accepted as somebody that's from Hawaii, because it's pretty locals only, especially when I first came here in the 80s. Second thing I think is I just wanted the listeners to hear as your bona fides in dealing with big numbers. Something that I struggle with when I got into government and when I got into federal government was I'm used to seeing big numbers, but I'm also used to allowing them to drive my behavior and me to have people that can react to that professionally. And I think sometimes what I've learned in government is I kind of had to have patience. And so some of the things that I wanted to talk to you about is your transition as you come into Hawaii and you decide that you think you might run for office. I know in 20 you ran, in 21 you took over your seat, and 43 years in business. But I'm very curious, as you were getting ready, what were some of the things that you did to start getting ready for a transition? I noticed you're on a lot of boards and philanthropy, very similar to me. I wanted to make sure I could understand what it would be like for donating my time and doing it for the right reasons, but you had so much to offer, and I was just curious, how do you gauge yourself to get ready to go into city government?
Well, first of all, it wasn't anything that I contemplated, really. But I knew that at the time I was 73 years old, I knew that I wasn't going to stay at the dance much longer. That I was not only getting up in years. I mean, I felt good. I could do the job, but you don't want to overstay your visit. And I felt very proud of what we were able to do at my last stint at Hawaii News Now, because we went from analog television into a digital era, and not only that, we jumped all over mobile technology and took a newscast and really understood the triumph of personal media over mass media. And so we were really there on a cutting edge, and a lot of stations all over America were looking at us, assembled a really incredible group of people, and provided a really good service. In fact, the way we used to sum it up is we went from after 2008 and the Great Recession here, it took a bunch of disparate television stations, all of which were on life support with disgruntled owners, and out of that forged something that really was a 21st century multimedia company for Hawaii. It was a significant contribution on the landscape. But I never really considered doing that, but I bring up the TV background because it wasn't just about my outreach in the community or any kind of philanthropic activities and leadership roles. It was the lens that I was afforded in running the quality of newsroom. I wasn't running it, but I was in my television station, and the men and women that I worked with and had the privilege of working with, one of which, my former news director, is now a communications director here, is a longtime friend of mine, Scott Humble. We worked together for almost 20 years. But that lens, when you're in a newsroom and you're doing the things that we used to do, you knew who the players were and you knew who the issues were. So it's not like I was in another field. We used to look at that very closely, very intensely. And I can't tell you, one election night after another, talking to the winners and the losers and following races and so on. So I looked at that as like, what am I going to do when I retire? And I felt like I had a lot in my tank. I wouldn't have run against an incumbent. My ambition wasn't there, but the job was open. The guy was churning out. And quite honestly, at the time, since I lived here and loved this place, I looked at the people raising their hands and who wanted to be mayor. And I didn't have a good answer for people who would say to me, Rick, you need to run because you could do a better job. More so, as part of that acceptance, there were people here who I respect in very prominent places were telling me things like, you owe this to Hawaii.
Wow, that's powerful.
It's like payback time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question? So you decide to go run for office. I don't know about you. I remember the first night that I ran for public office and I won. The next morning you wake up and it's like a scene from The Graduate. Now what? Mm-hmm. And if you look at running government like a business, your platform, you had focused on, homelessness, you had focused on affordable housing, on getting real with the rail. There was a bunch of different things. But I was just curious, when you started getting in, what was the mindset or transition to kind of get yourself into government?
Okay. Well, let's backtrack just a little
Sure.
bit, okay? Because one of the things that I learned from having been in the news business for a lot of years was we did research. So once I made a decision, which was on December 27th, 2019, which ironically enough was my mother's 100th birthday, which was the inspiration for that decision. The woman who was the reason I came to Hawaii. And it was late. Everybody was telling me, and I said, give me till after the holidays. They were even telling me that was late. So I made that decision on that day. And then I was able to retire very quickly from Hawaii News Now on January 15th and subsequently announced on February 12th. In that time, once I made that decision, I went out and hired the #1 political research firm in town and asked them to do a really deep dive. We oversampled the 9 council districts, did a sample size of 1,240, because I really wanted to get a pulse. And again, this is pre-COVID. I wanted to understand from the standpoint of having talking points as a candidate what mattered most to people. So I can tell you then homelessness was #1, the rail was #2, affordable housing was #3, public safety was 4, infrastructure was 5, and elder care was 6. Top 6, they're big, and that became a talking platform. So I already knew that was an agenda, and it wasn't necessarily a surprise, but I knew that would be those are the relevant talking points, and we worked our way through the primary. But the dynamic at play that I'm really proud of is that, we announced on February 12th, and March 7th, we have our first case of COVID, and by the 20th of March, some 6 weeks later, this place is locked down.
Right.
And we stayed locked down. In fact, just a way of getting through a campaign became a never-ending series of Zoom calls, and also you weren't able to fundraise. Mm-hmm. And you're trying to figure it out, never having been in a political office. Mm-hmm. And now you get elected. You win the primary in August, and then you go against somebody and you win in the general. And not only do you win big, you win by an unprecedented amount.
58%, I believe.
Yeah, we won by 20 points.
Yeah.
Which was pretty good, given the fact that the other guy had more than a year's start, had all the union support, and outspent me by $3 million. I felt pretty good about that. So that's a referendum at the same time.
Yep.
And so my first thoughts go back to my background in sports. We have to put the team together. I'd never put a cabinet together. In fact, most of these jobs in the cabinet director positions, I didn't even spend time to understand what I needed and what did my director of environmental services, for example, mean, and for that matter, really, what's the distinction between wastewater and sewer water? That kind of stuff. So was all of that. And so we opened up a portal. We did something untraditional because I didn't owe anybody anything. And I was humbled by the quality of men and women that came forth in November and December of 2020. And we had been locked down. People willing to give up big private sector jobs, inspired by the fact that I'd come from the private sector, made it clear throughout. And everybody knew because of my age I wasn't building a political career, but drove that point home that we're here to serve. And this is what this would be about. Had, I think, earned a pretty good reputation in town as a citizen, not just in my work at Hawaii News Now, but the other things. So there was a lot out there to deliver for the people in the way of integrity and trying to make a difference and work against these incredible problems. And we put together a cabinet that was really, really strong, that we've made very few changes to. I let them hire their own deputies. They brought in 18 new deputies. So when we get sworn in on January 2nd, 2021, which today is the 2nd, so I should really count however many months that is, I guess, you know, a little bit more than 2.5 years ago, 31 months ago, I guess. I was really inspired by them. I was humbled by them because putting together that team and the conversations that took place, they weren't just job interviews. This was like a calling kind of a time. It was almost, I'm hesitant because of the incredible, terrible war in Ukraine to say it was like a wartime condition, but it felt like that. It felt like people said, I want to do this because this is my home.
Yep.
This is where my family is. My kids are growing up, and we need to get through this.
Yeah, so it's a special place, and
Right.
everybody kind of throws their oar in behind.
So we went into it that way, and it was, you know, and I knew I would have a very steep learning curve. In fact, that was the biggest challenge of all, Troy, was to leave a business that I'd been in for 43 years. That no matter what came at us day in, day out, there was a certain familiarity to it. I mean, even though you lived on the edge about expecting the unexpected, but this was, you had to leave what you were comfortable with and be willing to accept the fact there was a lot you didn't know, a lot, and that's humbling, especially after you've just had a pretty good career.
Mayor, can I ask you a question? So when I finally made it through Senate confirmation to be the Chief Financial Officer for Homeland, from that day I knew I might only be in office for a year or two, and really would depend on what happened in elections. When I was doing research, getting ready to have the discussion with you, you always talk with a sense of urgency for your city and for Honolulu, the island. I was just kind of curious, that sense of urgency, how do you balance that with sending that messaging to your staff, your cabinet? And I also want to ask you, how do you balance it as a professional that's had to depend on, quote, career people, not just political? I seem to have an affinity to connect better sometimes with career people that I trust, and they can help me get stuff done a lot faster. And sometimes the political people are like, hey, we don't go with the career. But as a leader, you set the tone. And so with the clock running and your mix of folks, how do you deal with that?
Well, you do it by recruiting. That's why we changed the leadership team. I mean, first of all, as a backdrop, we knew, not just me as mayor, but the leadership team that we were going to assemble was about to inherit a workforce of 10,000 people. And there's a thing in politics, which I'm sure you're aware of, called the we be syndrome, right? We be here before you, we be here after you. And quite honestly, we did not inherit, not just because of COVID, a well-oiled machine.
Right.
Okay? That was part of the inspiration to run. So when you're in the business of selecting your leaders, you need to know what you're looking for. And if there's anything I ever took from my old football days, it was, if you're going to go recruiting, know what it is you need, not who. Don't fall in love with the wide receiver when you need an offensive tackle.
Right.
Be smart and be disciplined. So we looked for certain common denominators in the people who applied. We looked for proven track records of success. I looked for people who had those intangible leadership qualities, the kinds of people would follow in this town, people with good communication skills, people who understood adversity and the uncertainty of that adversity, and who wouldn't fade easily against difficult situations. So while it was a very eclectic group of people, if you will, based on their professional skill sets, there were some really strong common denominators. And so that was the first approach in the mindset, was we're going to have a team of people who heard everything and knew everything about the silos in the city and its dysfunction and why that wasn't working. And we said we're going to bring in a different dynamic, which is why I changed 23 of the 26 directors, and they brought in 18 new deputies. I put a lot on leadership. And so what I've told these people is, I'm not a micromanager, never have been, and in this situation, I cannot be, because I will never live long enough to understand in your field of knowledge and expertise what it is you really do. I am going to have to trust you in a way maybe you've never been trusted before, but I'm also going to hold you accountable to make sure you're doing the job you need to do. And that's how we approached it, one by one. I told them all, no matter how much success you've had, I'm not looking back, we're looking forward. This job under these circumstances, because leadership is situational, has the opportunity to be the most gratifying work of your life. And I keep on that subject with them. I might have even said it at my cabinet meeting earlier today. And that's the challenge for all of us at this moment in time. And I think that's the psychic income, if you will, you get in a job like this, because none of them are really doing it for the money. This is not a get-rich job for any of us. I think people in city government are criminally underpaid based on the talents that I see, especially at the high levels and the scope of responsibility that they take on. But that said, it's a lot of fun to work around people who are passionate and committed to where they live and wanting to improve it for the sake of their families and future generations. That's a very inspiring opportunity.
No, and I appreciate that, Mayor. And I, moving from the teamwork to something you and I had talked about before we got on mic here was, right now there seems to be a significant focus in government at all levels, city, county, state, federal, on modernization. And, when you look at that, I've noticed some comments that you had made when you came in were, and by the way, not unique to city, because it's happening at the federal level. A lot of folks really are struggling. And the question I have for you is that, I would think in Hawaii specifically, here, you have traditional ways of doing business where relationships may be ineffective or maybe inefficient, but they definitely help maintain the glue of the community, and modernization can kind of fly into the thick of it. How do you step back knowing that you've got to make, the clock is ticking, the sands of time, you and I just talked about it, but you need to make some strategic moves to help this city going forward, and you need to make some short-term moves that you can actually get some short-term wins.
Right.
How do you balance that?
Good question. Look, you heard me rattle off a few moments ago what the research told us about, homelessness, the rail, housing, et cetera. Nobody, and during the campaign, even for that matter, was there ever a discussion about the staffing issues at the city or the shortage thereof, or certainly about modernizing the city. So you come in and you get elected and you're sworn in the second year of the third decade of the 21st century, and you start to look around its capability because you're interested in driving performance. And we look at our data center, and they're running with computers from the 70s and the 80s. In fact, when we pulled them all out, they were still using DOS, and so that also impacts your workforce and what its capabilities are, and so on and so forth and down the line. So we started talking about how we were going to address the staffing issues, the shortages. We had 3,000 vacancies at the city, and people had gotten really adept at making excuses why things couldn't happen because they didn't have enough manpower. Understandably, but you don't want to be in the business, especially where people are paying taxes and deserve to have good core city services. The leadership needs to do something about that. And how and what were we going to do about that? Or for that matter, what kinds of investments, not just in technology. Technology is one thing, and whatever software you incorporate, but it's also the impact that has on the human element, the people who work with that stuff, and how they function in that respect. So we've taken those things on, which you could, that's not a quick fix. And one of the things that you talk about staffing, I found out because we did all the diagnostics, it took 6 months to get hired here at the city, 6 months. And quite honestly, for an employee base of 10,000, you want to talk about from the private sector things you learn. One of the really basic fundamentals, the city did very little recruiting. I mean, I'm not even going to call it job fair recruiting, handing out flyers. Virtually no recruiting, nothing in the operating lines on retention and development, nothing. And then no succession planning, woeful, none. And any great company of any caliber, and especially this is people didn't want to refer to this as I was running. They were trying to use it against me. Government's different, it's not business, whatever. But you're running an organization. I don't care what you want to call it, whatever term you want to put against it. You have an entity of 10,000 people, and you're not in the business of recruiting in order to keep it replenished. You're not in the business of recruiting, of developing and retaining good people so that they can grow in your organization and be even more productive, or for that matter, understanding leadership changes, that you're going to have good succession. And you're not doing that, that is really flawed. So that's some of the stuff we're working on that's outside the realm of typical political stuff. But to me, if we get this right over the course of time, it'll be an incredible contribution. In fact, I'll go so far as to tell you, part of our thinking is we understand the decisions we're making and where we're taking things. And I really believe it, because we're counting on having the next 5.5 years. There is a second term in here. We're going to keep pushing for as long as we can. We're counting on really changing the trajectory of this city from where it was. We're changing its course. That's how significant the decisions and the actions we're taking now and what it means for the future of this place.
Yeah, Mayor, I really commend you like I said, I see it. I'm a tech exec at IBM. I see this type of stuff. It is human-centered design first now, not technology. It's really trying to figure out what the business problem is, and it definitely sounds like you have your finger on the pulse. Let me just ask you this, kind of as we get ready to kind of close. Hawaii is known to have a very strong business community, even being resilient after the pandemic. I'm here. I've been here a couple times since the pandemic. It's back on fire. It feels like.
Well, tourism is back.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
We're still dealing with the remnants of COVID somewhat, but it's a resilient community. You're right. We're island dwellers. That's what's unique, and there's a certain cultural thing to that.
Well, and I also notice, obviously with deep and local cultural appreciation, any advice you'd give to people that are getting ready to really try to integrate into a community or a company where you might be determined to be a little bit of an outsider? You and I talked again a little bit before this, and it's like, as a consultant, you come into a corporation, you're never going to be that 20-year employee, and you've got to earn the trust of the people. You got to try to, I always say in consulting, you have 100% access, you have 100% ability to influence and zero decision making. Now you come in, you have masterfully and like I say, I say this with respect because I did the research, you've been able to come in and really embody yourself into being the island, the people, and they voted you as a referendum. What advice would you give people in a professional sense, not just politically, of trying to get into an organization and play the long game? Anything that you could?
I'll give you two anecdotes on that. One is really simple. What I tell people when they want to transition to Hawaii, I tell them that it's a really simple secret if you want to make it here: be a giver and not a taker. This is an island economy. It's just an island culture that's seen a lot of people come over the course of time and take advantage of people, or for that matter, think they're smarter or whatever else, and it's theirs, and that doesn't work. You've got to be a giver. You need that kind of humility. But from a business standpoint, let me just tell you a quick anecdote, and I'll try to tell this story in less than 60 seconds. I learned this lesson from a long time ago from a guy who's now passed on, Dr. Mortimer Feinberg. At the time, he was professor emeritus at Baruch College at NYU. Was a very prolific author, was published regularly in the Wall Street Journal, had a big firm in New York City, did a lot of research on what they used to call industrial psychologists, somewhat before the HR movement, right? So he was hired by this group of Fortune 200 companies to try to determine the X factor and what they were missing in recruiting, in that they were hiring the creme de la creme, the very best from the schools of America, offering them all the trappings that you could possibly get, not just with vertical growth, but power, all that, money. And some of these people, a lot of these people were exactly who they hoped they would be and went on and became very, very, very good corporate executives. And others were not, and they were blowing up. But when they would blow up, it wasn't like in the beginning. They got far enough along in the food chain, if you will, that when they blew up, there was a lot of collateral damage. And we're trying to ascertain what it was they were missing in the recruiting, because this was the creme de la creme. These were the very best. And so I'm giving you the cliff notes here, the short version, but it really came down to a personality flaw. And what it really was people who couldn't handle their own success. And so what it was, their flaw became arrogance. And they just alienated everybody around them, and they forgot understanding. They had no humility in them. And that's when he first told me a great line that I've used many times in and talking to young leaders, and he told me at the time it was from the Greeks. I should look it up. I'm sure there's an attribution somewhere. I've never really researched it, but it simply said that, before the gods destroy a man, they first make him vain. And I've seen that vanity, that narcissism undo more people in more places, high and low, over the course of time. So I would tell somebody one of the really key secrets to leading is to be vulnerable and have humility about you and recognize that, the organization you put around you, if you're strong and confident enough, is, surround yourself with a lot smarter people, and you don't have to be that person, that top down. Mm-hmm. And if I took anything away from my years in coaching, it was that. Because I was a pretty good player, but when I started coaching at the level I was coaching at, I was coaching guys better than me. They were bigger, they were stronger, they could hit harder, they could run faster. And I get comfortable in my own skin working with people who were better than I was as a player. And that carried over into I've never feared hiring better, smarter people.
Wow, Mayor. Great advice. That is awesome. Well, Mayor, I just wanted to tell you again, I thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy day to meet with me. You're doing great work here in Hawaii. I'm honored to be able to have the opportunity to talk to you. Thank you.
No, Troy, thank you. I've enjoyed the experience, and thank you for the consideration. We've just met today, but I appreciate how you've conducted yourself in the line of questioning. I hope whoever listens to it, maybe there's something they can glean from this that'll benefit them.
Great. Thank you, Mayor. Mahalo.
You're welcome.
Thanks again for joining me today on the Ameritocracy Show. Be sure to follow me on social media and our website at troyedgar.com, where you can get more information and sign up for my weekly email. I hope you have a great week.